the book of Exodus in chapter 16, verses 2 through 15. If you want to follow along in your own Bibles, you may do so.
No.
So just a little context. The book of Exodus is the story of the Hebrew people, God's chosen, leaving slavery in Egypt and traveling to the promised land, right? We all need a goal, the promised land to get to. And of course, most of the journey, most of the book is spent in the wilderness. That's the part we like to skip. But the wilderness is a huge part of our journey to God, right? And you don't have to go looking for it. It finds us. And so the trick here, the invitation, I think, is not to resist it, but to embrace its difficulties as gifts, as blessing. So we're forgiven if we grumble and complain. Our spiritual ancestors did. And if we're human, we'll probably do a fair bit of complaining and grumbling along the way too. So let's cut them and ourselves some slack as we listen for God's word in this text. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we that you complain against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard the complaining that you utter against him, what are we? Your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the Israelites, draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining." And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked toward the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I have heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there was on the surface of the wilderness a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." And we turn to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. Again, let us listen to God's word. "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now, when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day in the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, if I were to ask the question this morning, who would like to experience more spiritual growth in their lives, right? I would imagine that most everybody would say, "Yeah, that's of course, I want spiritual growth." But then if I ask the follow-up question, and it's always a follow-up question where the problem is, so the follow-up question is, are you willing to pay the cost for spiritual growth? And if you're like most human beings, there's a yes and a no to that answer, right? Depends. So this story of complaining in the wilderness, and then we get to grumbling about the wages. I call the sermon "Grumbling and Gratitude." As most scriptural passages, they work on multiple levels. There's the surface level, which is just the story of our spiritual ancestors, the people of Israel, crying out in slavery in Egypt to God, God hearing the voice, sending a leader, Moses, to rescue them and to lead them to freedom, to their own agency in the promised land. But as I said, there's this 40-year period of wandering in the wilderness, and there's a lot of complaining going on, right? So that's the surface meaning of the story. But all of these passages have deeper meanings. And really, it's the story of any soul's journey towards God. It's the story of the invitation, or us crying out because we experience some kind of inner lack of freedom. We don't like the word slavery, but we feel trapped in ourselves, or trapped in our lives, or trapped about certain aspects of selves in our lives, and we cry out to God. And God promises to bring us to a greater place of spaciousness and freedom in our lives, a promised land, if you will. But the way to the goal is through the wilderness. And we grumble, we complain, and we'll be tempted, just like the people in this story, to say, "Man, if this is what the spiritual life is like, I think I'd really rather not. Let's go back to Egypt, where at least I don't have to struggle for my next meal." But this is the thing. and I say this over and over and over again. We've come to age of Christianity in the context of a consumerist culture, and really, our true religion is consumerist. We've been baptized in it from our birth. We've been inundated with billions of commercials, all very subtly, training us in how we think and how we see. And so we inevitably bring that lens to play in our thinking about religion. It's a consumer transaction, right? You come, you pay for your services, and then someone like me delivers God to you. And if you're not really happy with your life, you might be complaining about me. you know, and as Moses says, who are we? That you're complaining against us. The complaints with God, right? So, what our spiritual tradition says is really clearly throughout the scriptures. It's really clear with all of the mystics and the saints and the contemplatives that the spiritual journey is no walk in the park, right? It's meant to be difficult because the only way we can get to the freedom of a new self, and that's really what we're after. That's what the promised land is. It's not some place we go when we retire where all of our needs will be taken care of. And guess what? We'll still be miserable unless we bring to our lives a new self. And the only way to get to that new self is by dying to the old self with all of its preferences and all of its aversions. Just watch yourself complain throughout the day, and not as a way of beating yourself up or to patting yourself on the back, but just watch how natural that instinct is. And it's a common human instinct. It's just how we've been taught to think. We don't like our circumstances. We wish that they would change. We don't like this coronavirus. We wish it would change. Just on and on. We don't like, this racial tension, whatever side of the ideological spectrum we're on. We're complaining about it one way or another. Just watch it and see it maybe as an invitation, right? To look at what we're going through differently, not as something to be avoided, but something to be embraced as the wilderness, if you will, of our own inner purification and transformation. What God is wanting to do is to bring us into the promised land of a new self. Not the self that is limited, but imprisoned, if you will, by all of our internal reactions, but one that learns how to see these, to bring them into the presence of God inside of ourselves, and slowly but slowly find that capacity within us to let this go. And in the stillness of that practice, something deeper than ourselves begins to take hold, offering us, maybe for the first time in our life, something that resembles true freedom. But again, the pathway to true freedom is demanding. It's a daily dying self. So don't be surprised. I've been on this planet for 63 years, and faith has been front and center throughout my life. I was blessed by a wonderful, encouraging, nurturing mother, and God was real to me from the beginning and has been real to me throughout my life. But I've had my moments, like all of us. And there've been times where I'm like, in the words of Julian of Norwich, God, if this is how you treat your friends, it's no wonder you have so few of them. Because we will find ourselves in the wilderness. And that's to be embraced. Because that is the purifying element helping us to let go ever, ever more deeply until all there is God in us. Our will is totally submitted to God's will. And so whatever is showing up, we see it not as something to run away from, but something that is our teacher from God. And that humility and purity of spirit to be able to say, I don't want this, but Lord, not my will, but yours be done. What is the gift of this, in this, for me? How much different would our lives be? How much different would our culture be if we could lean into that practice? So, yeah, we'll get out, we'll get good attention. Yeah, John, I'm going to really go take this spiritual practice. I'm going to engage in all the disciplines and all of this stuff. And, then you get, I've been doing really intentional spiritual practice for a long time now. And it's pretty regular for me. And I got to tell you, there's still times where I'm like, who am I fooling? you know, uh, who do I think I am? Right? And yet you just keep coming up, and God provides. What is this stuff? That's what they called the manna, manhu. It's a play on words in Hebrew. What is it? Well, it's the bread of God for you. God sustains us in the wilderness. He gives us meat. He gives us bread. God gives us food for the journey, the food that we need. So it's this encouragement. Don't give up. The wilderness is hard. Don't give up. God will supply. This COVID thing is hard. God will supply our needs. God is using this time. God is using our civic unrest even to wake us up and to ask more from us, to bring us to greater freedom, to bring us to a new self. So for me, Egypt represents just the ego. So the ego, it can be collective or it can be individual, right? We have both. So the ego is just that wants to cover over anything that it doesn't want to look at, right? It's interested in presenting an image to the world. It's interested in projecting an image of beauty and strength and most of all virtue. So just notice that in the public discussion, how we're defending our righteousness and our virtue against each other, trying to claim the high ground. And watch that in your relationships too, when you're having an argument with somebody that you love, but you're bumping up against each other, and there's something in you that wants to claim the high ground, right? And to get the other to admit that they're not as virtuous as you are, right? Just subtle temptation to watch that happen. So Egypt's just a symbol for that, and so it's a beautiful symbol because Egypt had such wonderful things, right? The pyramids, how impressive, right? To project this public image, the Sphinx and all of the numbers, the armies and the culture and all the beautiful stuff. I don't want to say the ego's all bad. We need an ego. We need a persona to live in the world, and we need a collective persona. But notice that there is a huge shadow, a huge unacknowledged shadow in every ego, yours, mine, and the collective. And with it is violence. With it comes this energy that resists God's invitation to true spiritual freedom. So once you really start getting serious about saying, I want to go on this path of letting go with God, watch the resistance within yourself, wanting to go back to defend the image, to defend the impressiveness, to defend the high ground we instinctively want to claim, and then to deny the shadow. No, that could not possibly be, right? We don't want to own any part of the conflict that we find ourselves. No. The fault is there. The fault's not here. It's a sure sign that the ego is at work, keeping us, sisters and brothers, in slavery. This spiritual calling of letting go we find just too hard to do. So we prefer, the slavery, the image defending, the violence of pointing the finger of blame at the other. And we do this at ourselves too. Some of us we're our worst critics. If you were ever to write down your inner dialogue, the names we call ourselves, or the names we call others, again, because it's just too hard for us to own the shadow of the ego, individual or collective. So we're called to be stripped of all of that in the in the figurative wilderness of our own inner purification. And our purification is not, again, to be, well, I'm virtuous, see how virtuous I am. The purification is to prepare ourselves to receive this incredible presence that is always there. It's just we're so muddied up with our inner stuff, we cannot even begin to see it. And so the purification is not to create a virtuous ground to stand on. It's to burn away the stuff in us that gets in the way of us experiencing the fullness of the presence of God that is always there. So it's an encouragement. See everything in your life as an opportunity to burn away some of the stuff in you that resists a fuller experience of God. And this is why I found myself just really totally immersing myself in the mystics and the contemplatives of our heritage. Because when you read them, you never see them patting themselves on the back. You see them saying, wow, I have really got this down, man. I am really cruising. You never see them defending themselves at the expense of another and saying, see how good I am. I'm not like that so-and-so over there. That's what Jesus talked about in that parable of the Pharisee and the sinner and the prayer, and the Pharisees, the sinner's just like, oh God, I don't even deserve to be here. And the Pharisees saying, I do everything right. At least I'm not like that poor sod. The mystics never get there because they're way too busy looking at their own inner stuff and seeing their own falseness, seeing their own illusions, seeing how the only ground they possibly had to stand on is the ground of God's mercy. And so just be aware of our complaining and put that in the context of what our invitation towards God is supposed to look like. It's supposed to look like a letting of all of that go so that we can see that the mercy and love of God is the only ground we have and the only ground that anyone else has. So, just turn on the news and you see the complaining, all those people are protesting. Again, the problem with COVID and the difficulties that's created for us, or the problem of our political divide, whatever it is, just notice that and see if there is a different way that we can begin to show up. So I'm going to switch finally to Jesus and this parable. I've always hated this parable, and I'm 63. This was the first time I really saw the parable, the point of it. That it's not about, who works more and, who gets paid what. It's totally about the generosity of the landowner. Did you catch that? So one of the reasons I think I've had a hard time understanding this parable is because my life has been largely privileged. Not that I'm particularly wealthy, but my life has been one of great privilege. And I've always tried to be a good guy. And so, I'm reading the parable thinking about my brother who was always cutting corners, and he's getting paid the same thing as me. That just, rubs against the grain. But what we have in this parable are day laborers. We're talking about day laborers. We're not talking about, people, living large. These are people who are waiting out, at the place where the day laborers hang out at, waiting for somebody to come by and offer them work. And if nobody offers them work, they don't have food that day. So if you think about it in that way, who were the fortunate workers and who were the unfortunate workers, right? I mean, before the wages were paid out, probably the ones who were hired first thing in the morning felt fortunate because they knew they were going to get a day's wage and they knew they were going to be able to feed their families that night. Whereas those who were hanging around at 5 o'clock, why are you hanging out at 5 o'clock? Because nobody's hired us. And they're wondering, am I going to be able to feed my kid tonight? So this is what Jesus always does, right? The first will be last and the last will be first. The landowner loved everybody. He didn't really need these people at 5 o'clock. He went out and gave them work so that he could give them money because he knew that they were going to starve if he didn't do it. And we're sitting around saying, grumbling because life isn't fair. Because somehow our side isn't being recognized as much as that side. Right? Isn't this all that we do? Is we grumble. They're being recognized, but I'm not being recognized. And what God is saying is, my mercy is here for you all the time. And it always will be here for you. Stop complaining. And start mirroring my mercy. If you see someone in need, love them. If you see someone imprisoned by their own ideological stance, show them mercy and love. And stop taking the bait. The first will be last, the last will be first. It's Jesus' way of saying, there's no difference. You all count. You all are my children. Each and every one of you is my beloved. Don't you know that? Don't you know that now? So here we are in the wilderness. We don't like it. We wish it was different. We wish that some of these people out here who irritate us weren't around. This is God's blessing to us, to be right here in the midst of each other. It's the purifying fires of God's Spirit at work within us, trying to lead us to a new self. Not the self of the ego. It'll still be with us, but that self in which God is all in all. And when God is all in all the energy we'll have is for forgiveness and mercy and compassion and understanding and a desire for each one's blessing. It's a hard practice. And don't take it literally, but just lean into it and see if anything changes. Most of all, in your own heart. Maybe so, my sisters and brothers. I think we're going to get a lot of wilderness practice in the weeks ahead. May we see God's mercy in it and in each other. Amen.